It's very good to be with you again. Last time we looked at the Last Supper, and after the supper the disciples go out onto the Mount of Olives and into the Garden of Gethsemane. It was a peaceful place where they liked to go for prayer. Judas has already left them, so Jesus takes 11 disciples. He takes Peter, James and John a little further into the garden. He tells them to wait for him and to pray for him, and he goes ahead and prays to his Father. This is his prayer. Father, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. When he returns, Peter, James and John have fallen asleep, and this is repeated twice more in the episode. Judas leads the Roman soldiers into the garden and betrays Jesus with a kiss. Jesus is arrested. Soon afterwards, all the disciples flee, and later on, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. We're going to look at 2 paintings of the Gethsemane episode. The first was painted in 1460 by Mantegna, who was born in Venice and lived a lot of his life in the north of Italy. If you'd like to see it, it's in the National Gallery in London. So we have in the foreground our sleeping disciples. Peter, always shown older, John, always very young, and James. Above them is Jesus on a rock, praying to his Father with his back to us. In the top left-hand corner, we see a group of cherubs holding the symbols of the Passion. They have a column to which Jesus will be tied and whipped, and a crucifix, a spear, and a sponge with vinegar. On the right-hand side, at ground level, we see Judas leading in the Roman soldiers and a mob from Jerusalem. We know that Mantegna was interested in classical architecture, and so if we look at the buildings to the right of Jesus, we see quite a mishmash of different styles of buildings. Immediately to the right of Jesus, we see a building that looks very much like the Colosseum in Rome. And then to the right of that, a very tall tower with a half moon on the top, typical of Middle Eastern buildings. A little further to the right, we see a smaller tower, which resembles the Campanile in St. Mark's Square in Venice. So this is the local boy, proud of his hometown. And then a series of square buildings. Mantegna was from the north, and we know that in cities like Milan and Ferrara, this was the popular style of architecture. Mantegna was also interested in nature, and if you look high above the tree on the right-hand side, you can see a bird sitting in the tree, probably a crow, and crows speedily make their way to dead bodies and blood. So here is a hint of Jesus' forthcoming death. Notice that the crow is immediately above Judas. After all, it was Judas's kiss that ultimately led to the death of Jesus. Above the disciples, pushing out of the rock, you can see a little sapling. Scholars think this may represent the tree on which Judas ultimately will hang himself when he realizes the horror of what he's done. Further down at ground level, you can see little plants pushing their way through out of the rock. I wish I could tell you the significance of them. They look much like the weeds on my patio, but I'm sure there will be some significance, not least his interest in the natural world. What I can tell you is there are a number of rabbits in this painting. Look over on the ground on the bottom right-hand corner. Rabbits have great significance. They always symbolize fertility and new life. So Mantegna has put them in to remind us that the death of Jesus was not the end. It would lead on to the resurrection. And so for Jesus and for us, this is not the end. Our second painting was painted 30 years later in 1490 by an artist called Perugino. And if you'd like to see this one, you need to go to Florence to the Uffizi Gallery. In many ways, it is very similar to the Mantegna. I'm sure he would have seen the Mantegna original and been influenced by it. So in the foreground, we have our three sleeping disciples. This time John on the left, and then Peter, and then James. It's good to remember that most of the disciples were just teenage lads who turned the world upside down. On the left-hand side, Judas is leading in the mob, who've come to watch events unfold. A crucifixion was something of a spectator sport. Perugino loved symmetry, so he has divided up his group into two. And on the right-hand side of Jesus, we see the Roman soldiers coming in. The landscape in the background is certainly not Italian. Perugino was from Umbria, particularly from Urbino, an international city. So perhaps he is suggesting a French or German landscape. There are far fewer details in this painting. No bird, no weeds, no rabbits. Perugino's focus is different. He wants us to see Jesus' face. And if we look at it closely, as well as marvelling at the way he's depicted the skin tones, I see a youthful face full of sadness, but also calm. Enjoy the colours in this painting, the wonderful pale pink that the angel is dressed in, and the drapery of it flowing out behind him. Look at Judas's very unusual long two-tone tunic and the strong colours of Jesus and the disciples. So what can we learn from these two paintings of Gethsemane? We have been living in a pandemic, in a time of great uncertainty and anxiety, particularly during the recent long lockdown. Many of us, perhaps all of us, would say we've been suffering in some way. Some physical suffering with the ghastly effects of COVID and even the death of loved ones. The mental suffering of not being able to be with our loved ones, and when we could, not being able to touch them. The confusion for those in care homes for whom everything has been so different. And for many people, it's been a time of acute loneliness and anxiety. And sometimes we've let down those that we're closest to. Whatever we're going through, Jesus understands and he walks with us. Mantegna stressed the physical pain of Calvary with those cherubs and the symbols they were holding. Perugino showed the sadness of Jesus' face. Interestingly, Renaissance artists don't usually call this painting Gethsemane. Their title is Agony in the Garden. But I would like to finish with two positives. When Jesus prayed to his Father, he stressed, "Thy will be done." And because of his great love for each of us, he was willing to endure all that torment. And secondly, think about those rabbits symbolizing new life for Jesus and for us. If we trust him, death is not the end. So whatever else happens to you next week, just remember those rabbits.